Okay, so this week's questions I asked you, as you think about the Kerch drone strikes in Russia and Russian attacks in the Black Sea, what questions would you like me to answer this week? So that's kind of the focus of where we're going. Before I do that, though, I want to go back to yesterday. Yesterday, I did this video. I was talking about the preposterous claim of 50,000 or 500,000 soldiers. Russia was saying that 500 Ukrainians were dead, and I said, "Oh, that doesn't even make sense that that could possibly be the case." Well, uh, in that video, I also ironically miscalculated when I was talking about, okay, there was if you have the multiplier of casualties of about 3, so that would be about 1,500,000. And then you divide that by the number of days, which is 567. But I inadvertently added a 0, so I was going out of 15 and said 26,555. Now, 2,655 deaths per day doesn't even make sense, right? But I said 26. It was a slip, but it's the kind of thing that Russia actually does. Like, they intentionally inflate by a 10-to-1 kind of margin, and it's almost poetic what a mistake I made. Still made a mistake. I'm showing you my mistake, but it's almost illustrative of what Russia does intentionally. Okay, let's get back to where we're going to be going today, and that's talking about these questions that you posed for me about the Black Sea and drone strikes and all kinds of other things along those lines. I'll try to answer everything that seems like a solid, like intentionally useful question, not somebody that's being a jerk or whatever. Okay, I guess my question is, at what point is the cost of losing their fleet so high that they need to make war stop to save what's left? Great question. Early in the war, this was last spring, not this past spring, but the spring before that. Maybe it was into the summer or something like. The Russians actually put their boats before. Okay, the Moskva was hit, and Russia actually put their ships out into the Black Sea, away from the Ukrainian border. Remember, I mean, part of the intention, it seems like, was to take Odessa and spread all the way over and take the entire, essentially make Ukraine landlocked. And that got foiled. The Moskva sinking really damaged the Russian psyche, and they had their boats in the Black Sea, ships out in the Black Sea, away out of missile range, but not near Sevastopol harbor. And that was intentional. Like, they were hiding their ships through distance. And so, at what point will the cost of losing their fleet so high? When Ukraine gets long enough range missiles that they can attack and continue to attack the Black Sea fleet or the harbor or whatever, they're going to have to think about what to do next. So that's how they answer your question. But I did this video, I don't know, it was pretty early, where like they were backing them up and they have no navy. I mean, it's incredible. Okay, as the air defense systems of Russia are being taken out one after another, what does it say about Russia and its weapons industry when it comes to such systems? Great job, sir. You've made me become the go-to person in my circle of friends when asking or when seeking balanced analysis about both parties. Lots of love from Nigeria. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I'm trying to be fair and honest. I support Ukraine, but I'm trying to like see things clearly. Okay, so it's not just air defense, but it's radar and TAMLF systems or Triumph systems and other things along those lines. Now, I'm not a military guy, but what I understand is that like taking out these systems one by one makes them progressively weaker and progressively more blind, for lack of a better term. Like they just can't detect things as well. But they are being taken out incrementally, and when that happens, things can get through. So the Ukrainians seem, in my estimation, very systematic about how they approach things. Like, they're not doing things just to score a win here. I blew up this thing, I blew up that thing. They're like one thing after another, and you can almost project what's coming next based on what they attack. So like one of the things that they're doing right now is trying to squeeze Crimea, and they're doing what they're setting the shaping the ground to squeeze Crimea, and I think that's fair. How are the people in Ukraine doing after all this time? And what's the best thing I can do to help support Ukraine? What does the UA need most? I'm not necessarily the best guy to do that, but I would say wherever. So let me give you an analogy. In World War II, um, at the Battle of Bastogne, the American forces are surrounded by the Germans, and the Germans offer them to surrender. Now, the American forces were the 101st Airborne, and they're surrounded, and they offer the terms of surrender. And before McAuliffe gives the answer to the Germans, he gathers his officers and says, Gentlemen, we have the greatest opportunity ever presented to an army in the field of battle. We can attack in any direction. What he meant was they're surrounded, right? And his answer went down in history. His answer was nuts. That was a one-word answer, and that was all he replied there at the time. And so the Ukrainians are in this place where, regardless of how you feel like contributing, you can contribute because you can attack in any direction. Like if you want to give to humanitarian aid, if you want to give to drones, if you want to give to this or that or the other thing, just make sure it's a legitimate charity that you're comfortable with, that is doing good work. I have put in the links below, since the very first video, Samaritan's Purse. Samaritan's Purse are the ones that gives the Christmas shoebox things every year all around the world. I was very comfortable with that. I added shortly thereafter United 24, and that's been in all the videos since then as well. So those are places that I feel comfortable with. Give to wherever you feel comfortable. That's a legitimate charity doing the kind of thing, whether it's humanitarian or military aid or some mix, or and look, there are Ukrainians in the United States and in Western Europe that are refugees that could use your help, and you don't have to take them into your home necessarily, but you can fractionally sponsor Ukrainians that need help. So I mean, there's many ways that you can do that. Okay. I have to quote an old candy commercial. Hey, Mr. Owl, how many licks does it take to get to the Kirch Bridge to fall down and never be of use again? Okay, I'm of such an age that I remember the Tootsie Pop commercial as well. Oh, let me see here. A 1, a 2, a 3, crunch, boom, splash, 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 a 3. So those of you in America will remember the Tootsie Pop, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop commercial? My audience is largely in the 50+ club. So I have almost nobody that watches me that's 20-something, which is sad, but I'm not everybody's cup of tea. How rapidly can cardboard drones be assembled in the field? From my understanding, it's very quick to assemble the drone and just pop in the parts, but I don't know for sure. I do know that the beauty of cardboard is it's difficult to detect by radar because you can't really pick very much up because it's not really made of metal or whatever, and so it's a pretty significant device as far as having enough of a punch to do something and not able, very difficult to detect until it's too late. We can see the poor training, supplies, discipline, and tactics across the Russian Army, Navy, Air Force. How bad is this in the branches that hold and deploy and maintain their nuclear forces? God help us. That is a horrifying question. I don't know. I mean, I have no knowledge of that kind of thing, but I can't imagine that it's a whole lot better, although you would think that they would put some, reasonable, smart stuff, people that have some brains. Like I know a number of people just because of where I live, and there was a nuclear base near where I had lived, and so I knew some people that were, in the military that had retired or gotten out that were in the area. So I've known people who are nuclear engineers, and they tend to be pretty sharp. So I'm hoping that that's the same over there as well. But I can't tell you. Which do you assess as being more valuable result of this strike? That 2 Russian military vessels are directly removed from the war, or that the entire fleet will now need to travel vastly further away from attack positions on Ukraine for safe anchor and maintenance facilities? So those things are both happening. So they got like multiple impacts for the one strike. They knocked out a sub that was worth 300 million. They knocked out a landing ship that was worth less. The estimates that I've seen, and thank you to those of you who have provided those in the comments. I read your comments. I don't necessarily reply to every comment, but I read your comments. And some were saying 80 million or 100, something north of 100 million, something in that neighborhood. But Ryan Macbeth was talking about how in shaping the battlefield, the transport ship was actually more important because they're destroying bridges. There's only so many ways in and out of Crimea, and what they're doing is choking off Crimea. And so they already knocked out another transport ship. This transport ship is gone. He seemed to think that the transport ship was more important than the scuttling of the sub, or not scuttling. I guess it didn't go underwater, but destroying the sub. So I'm going to lean on his expertise there. As far as backing up, they're getting the message and they're figuring this out. And I'd be terrified if I was a Russian admiral in charge of what's going on in the Black Sea, because that person is not going to last a whole lot longer. Okay, first there was Russian generals bingo. Now we have the Russian fleet bingo. Okay, fountain of knowledge, my word. Next, your videos on Russian media are helpful. You go in more depth than others. I really find them helpful. Maybe this is more of a comment than a question, but I don't think Western audience understand how effective this propaganda is in Russia. I think you're right. I think they think that this is, there's nothing to see there. It's Jerry Springer. No, I think there really is a lot, and particularly the older you are, the more you watch TV. And this I get from a Russian political scientist who said essentially the same thing, that the older they are, the more backing Putin they are, the more pro-Soviet, like old Soviet Union they are, the more they watch TV. The younger generation is more internet dependent than TV dependent. This person goes on, I married a Russian and she moved to my country. My children are half Russian. She has sadly become almost completely estranged from her family in Russia over this stupid war. Half of them are pro-war and the other half don't want to acknowledge it's happening, as subconsciously they realize how bad it is. They are politically apathetic, just as Putin programmed them to be. They eat this propaganda for breakfast in Russia, and I believe that we will laugh at all the absurd, laugh at and call absurd in the left, in the West. Okay, so now it's not just Solyov, and it's not just RT. I saw an interesting article that was talking about how this propaganda is pushed into everything that they watch on TV. So there was a New York Times article where the guy just watched nothing but Russian TV for a week, and he spoke Russian, so he understood what he was doing. But like in a daytime talk show, and they would say, our daytime drama, the doctor would be saying, well, you should get a Crimean onion. These are the best onions in the world, and they're more medicinal. And they work in these things about it throughout all their programming. And since they control their programming, they can do that kind of thing. I sadly see her face turn red when people recognize her accent and ask her where she's from, and she's just embarrassed to say the truth because of this horrible war and Russia's behavior. Yeah, and I said this very early on. I think Russians who recognize this are in a terrible position because their country is being condemned, but that person, that individual, may not be pro-Russia or happy about the war. They may be like, if they're supporting Ukraine or they recognize that this is wrong, like that, they're targeted even though they didn't have anything to do with it. There's even been a number of attacks on Russians in other countries in Europe, Europe and outside Europe, Georgia and other places, that just because they're Russian and because they're taking that out on them. Okay, there are a lot of Russians in the same boat. Sadly, they mostly live abroad. I don't mean to paint them as victims, as Ukrainians are clearly the victims, but more to point out that Russia will not become a rational actor within our lifetime as a majority of their people leave, or good people leave. Thank you, and please keep covering the Russian coverage of the war as you do it very well. Yeah, I think you're probably right. There's generational hatred now between Ukraine and Russia, or Russia and most of the West. It's building that way as well. But I feel sad for someone who is Russian, who is not supporting, who is trying to, like I don't have anything to do with this. I support Ukraine, and but still, it's a rough place to be. I saw this. I had a student who was from Iran, and when there were tensions between the U.S. and Iran, she would tell people I'm Persian. Well, she was telling the truth, but it's yeah, that's just an uncomfortable place to be, just because your country's being dopey. Okay. Has the Ukrainian counteroffensive effectively come to an end this year and Ukraine turn into long-range missile strikes instead? No, I think the counteroffensive is still going on the ground. It's very, very slow going, and it's slow going because they have to do things without air coverage that pretty much nobody else has ever had to do. And so it's an incredibly difficult, painful process, and it's very slow. But as I talked about in one of my videos, there's not just that on the ground, there's the long range strikes that are taking things out behind there. And then there's these other operations, drones hitting Moscow and Pskov and into the Black Sea, that are really stretching the Russians pretty significantly. So I think that that's also a very important part of what's happening. But I don't think the counteroffensive is over. I think they have about another 60 days of fight on the ground and before it becomes difficult, and then they're going to keep going. Just because they have to. This is, I mean, I see someone like Scott Ritter or Doug McGregor talk about, oh, the Ukrainians demoralized. There is no demoralization on their side. Are they tired? Yes. Are they exhausted? Sure. Are they demoralized? No. It's kind of like when I was in graduate school working on my master's and my PhD, I had very little money. I was poor, but I was never broke. I had hope. I saw what my future could be. Now, I know people that have money more than I had, but they're really broke. They're demoralized. They really don't have any hope of a future. There's a big difference between where I was and where they are. And I would take no money and hope any day. Same kind of thing as where the Ukrainians are. They see what their future is, and that they have an existential threat. Okay, Tim Sebastian at DW asked General Richard Sheriff an interesting, yeah, I saw that video, so I know where you're going here. An interesting question, I'll pose it to you. Is it an honorable stance in your view for the West to say to you, Ukraine, go ahead and fight and die for our values, and we will give you some of what you need to do that, but we're not going to risk upsetting your enemy too much, so he turns on us. I'll link the video, the full interview in a comment below. I saw that. That was the video where he said that we were I can't remember what the term was, like self restraining ourselves from self-deterrence, I think is the term that he used, self-deterring. And that's terrible that we've done that. Now, we've been very careful, maybe too careful, not to trip over a line that would cause World War III or nuclear war or something along those lines. But yeah, it's not fair. I mean, these guys, the the Ukrainians are more than willing to take the fight to the Russians, and I feel like we have an obligation, both because of the Budapest Memorandum and just morality, to arm them to defend themselves against Russian aggression. Samum, is it cool? I think you're talking about the Samum ship that was hit in the Black Sea. There looks like there was this smaller, like, I don't know what kind of patrol boat or whatever it is. I'm not a Navy guy. I don't understand. But a small was hit by a Ukrainian UAV in the Black Sea. I don't know what you mean by is it cool though, but one was hit apparently from some reports that I saw. The fact that Ukraine has destroyed a flagship destroyer and a submarine with no actual navy is amazing. Okay, so if you're talking about the events just a few days ago, it was a transport ship and a sub. Yeah, it is pretty amazing. I mean, with no navy, they've scored all the all kinds of points in the Black Sea. Looks like a hit list to me to keep the sinking feeling up. Ukraine have no mercy. Buka calling. I don't know if we're talking about Bucha for revenge for the atrocities in Bucha or what? But okay. Does organizational leadership include studies of criminal organizations? Not usually. Now, I have a fascination with that. Anything that I can find about a documentary about the mafia, cults, or dictators or things like that, I just find really interesting because I know how it's supposed to work, and then seeing how it's being twisted, I just find really interesting. Like look at Jim Jones in the People's Temple, or some kind of dictator like Saddam Hussein, and how he kept in charge by power, but then Saddam Hussein is like, when you saw Saddam before the judge at the end of his life, he's like, who are you to talk to me like that? Like, he still thinks everybody's going to say, oh yes, everything you say is brilliant, and he can't wrap his mind around that he's completely lost his power. Okay, at any rate, organized crime has its own code and virtues. I wonder if criminals tend to lie less prolifically and more strategically as they rise in power. If so, a leader relying on lies shows weakness. Do egos become harder to manage as criminals rise? What traits show that a political organization runs more like a business or a bureaucracy than a gang? Those are absolutely fascinating questions, Bruce. I'm going to say this. The more that I look at what's happening in Russia, the more that I see mafia rather than a state. It's really, really interesting. The more I look into how the oligarchs run and why they do what they do, and how Wagner operates, and it's like a mafia run country. It's very, very strange. But they have this thing about, like, they have to hold this sham of democracy. Like, I looked at the elections, particularly the elections in Ukraine, Russian-controlled Ukraine. The elections last week were across all of Russia, and not surprisingly, United Russia won big. That's Putin's party. They won big all over the country. But they need this veneer of democracy, even though we know it's not, like, things aren't right. And I specifically showed that in the video last week about how wrong it was in Russian controlled Ukraine. But you're onto something here. They do act like the mob, and they are very intent to. So if you think about it, like, in the follow the money kind of way, if you think about who's benefiting, a lot of things make more sense than if you just think about, for the sake of causing wanton violence, because that's not. I don't perceive them doing it that way so much as trying to grow their own little empires, and their underlings growing their little empires. Okay, hope that helps. Consequences of Su-24 shooting down a British NATO aircrew. Even with the most abject apologies, so close. Now, that didn't happen to my knowledge, but what would be the consequences of that? Yeah, that could be very, very bad. So yeah. What red line do you see for NATO to step in with Article 5? Do you think that we're inching closer? So I'm nervous that, so we said every inch of our border will defend, and then they didn't twice in Romania. And I'm nervous that someone like Putin will push that and just keep going and see how far he can go. And NATO doesn't really want to invoke Article 5. They don't. They want to supply Ukraine. They want to protect. Now, there's different parts or different wings in NATO, right? The Baltic states and Poland are the most hawkish, followed probably by the UK. And then there are parts that are like, we really are. I mean, we're kind of being dragged along here. We don't want to have anything to do with this. We want to restore friendly relations with Russia sooner than later. I think France is largely split in that kind of way. But I don't know. I mean, it would take I think, a legit cross-border incursion, not something crashing accidentally on their ground. But so I think when there was saber rattling about Wagner troops crossing the border into Poland or something along the lines back when Prigozhin was still alive, that kind of thing could have caused it. That, I mean, and you would say, well, they're not, part of actual Russian troops. but they are. I mean, they actually now have to swear allegiance to the Russian flag rather than to be just a mercenary group. At any rate, that's the kind of thing that would create this scenario. Don't think, I think it's a really dangerous thing, but I don't see it yet. I don't see the conditions ripe to happen right around the corner, at least. So I don't think that we're necessarily any closer than we were in the very beginning. How do you see the relationship between the maritime strikes and the ground offensive? Is there one at all? Great question. So the maritime strikes are providing space for the ground offensive to continue to operate. It's going very slow. Zelensky acknowledged it. I was listening to a podcast where Zelensky was talking to The Economist. It's going slow, but it's going forward. It's not stagnating. It's not just devolved to trench lines on either side. They are making progress. But because it's so slow, there's something else going on that's also stretching the Russians, that's also giving Ukraine victories along the way so that they can keep momentum going. And I think it's as much about the psychological momentum as it is about the actual strikes, although a $300 million sub here and $80 to $100 million transport ship there, and pretty soon it adds up to real money. So it's a pretty good thing that it's being stretched like it is, just like the drone strikes that are hitting Pskov and Moscow and other places. That's really causing that, it's creating real dilemmas for the Russians, and I think that that's a good thing, expanding the ground, expanding the scope of the counteroffensive. Okay, well, it seems to me Ukraine is doing it right. By the way, let me go back before we go to the relationship between the maritime strikes and the ground offensive. I think the maritime strikes are part of also choking off Crimea, and that's going to be part of the ground offensive, making Crimea untenable for the Russians to hold. If they can take Crimea, that is a coup for the Ukrainians. That is significant, and I think they're pretty intent on doing that. Okay, well, it seems to me Ukraine is doing it right. Taking all this high-dollar equipment should make Russia fall back and leave, you would think. I also think the bridge needs to come down. Give it time. I don't think, we haven't seen the last attack at the Kerch. If I were a betting man, I would say it's coming pretty soon. Hard and not repairable to stop one side of supplies coming in. The more Ukraine can take out, the more the hurt for Russia. Okay. Again, I mentioned Ryan Macbeth. He did a video yesterday or the day before where he was talking about just like the shaping conditions and what, there's only so many ways in or out of the Black Sea. You can fly things in, but that's expensive. Or you can ship things in, but they're losing those transports. You can take rail or and they've blown up some of the rail. They're stopping some of the roads. They're attacking the Kerch, so they're gradually choking Crimea, and I think that's a legitimate thing that they're doing. Okay, last week's Q&A, you denied that you sounded like Tucker Carlson. I hope I don't sound like Tucker Carlson, at least about Ukraine. However, I responded with a comment that showed instances where you used languages and sources that Tucker might use. For example, you said maybe there is, or if there is, or what Biden might have done, and there is more to it. You also cited 3 sources that make your next point: RT, Fox News, and the New York Post. Yeah, I take sources from everywhere. I mean, it's not just that. Now, before I go on and read the next paragraph, since you seem to not like me very much, that's okay. You don't have to like me. When I say these things, I'm saying, here's what's being said. Here's what could be. I don't think that that's it, but even if there is, this could still hurt. So the context there was like Biden and some kind of corruption with Ukraine. Let's use that as the example. I don't think that there necessarily is, but I don't know. If there is, it could still hurt Ukraine. And that would be, but here's what I said that was beyond where Tucker is and very different from Tucker. Inadvertently, that could hurt Ukraine. I don't want that to hurt Ukraine, and Ukraine should still be defended even if there was something going on here. I don't know that there is, but even if there is, they still should be defended against a ruthless Russian aggressor. So that's part of the difference between where we are. But I wasn't just asking those questions, just trying to throw a bomb out there. I'm trying to unpack what we know or what was out there in the in the discussion. It's important that you're aware of this side of the equation because much of the time you're not going to see it. I'll see it because I also read conservative news because I'm a conservative, so I see some things that you might miss. Just like I'm reading RT in order to see what they're saying in their assumptions so that we can say, why did they say that? What are they trying to communicate? Okay, I'd like to point out that both Fox News and the New York Post are owned by Rupert Murdoch, who recently paid for $800 million for spreading misinformation and defamation. We're talking about the Tucker Carlson thing with the voting machines. I'd like to ask you to explain how using such language and only citing those three sources is not Tucker-esque. Well, I think I just did that. I am referring to the specific time period from 1720 to 1830 in your video and credited Ukraine update. Here's the latest from Ukraine, published on August 29th. Okay, so the Snake Jake, please go back and look at the other 778 videos that I produced and see what is where I really stand on Ukraine. I'm all in for Ukraine. I'm trying to show you what's happening and where things are. This was something really happening where there were Republican congressmen that were bringing this kind of thing forward, and it could have an impact on Ukraine. Somebody emailed me the other day and said, I like what you say, but I wish you would stop talking about being a Republican. Wouldn't you rather that there were Republicans that were pro-Ukraine than than that? Like, I'm not talking about like arguing about tax cuts or school vouchers or other pro-Republican kind of things. I'm talking about Ukraine. I don't understand. Would you rather that the entire Republican Party was against Ukraine, or would you be happier to know that there are people like me that exist, that the old school conservatives like me are actually in Ukraine's corner? Okay, let's keep going. Why hasn't NATO provided Ukraine sufficient support to win this war in almost 2 years of fighting? You know, that British general that talked about self-deterrence is probably a big part of the answer. Putin has done a great job of deterring the West by nuclear saber rattling and threats of World War III, and so we've been far too slow, and that's unfortunate. How competent are NATO military leaders, and how effective is its training and weapons? NATO military leaders are very competent. Its training and weapons. The weapons are good, but they're slow in getting there. The training is not necessarily made for the type of warfare that they're engaged in right now in the trenches. It's engaged, like, NATO doctrine is different than what the Ukrainians actually have to fight. But the NATO training is better than what they otherwise would have had. So it's not exactly the same or exactly right, but it's better than not having it. So I don't know if that helps. Over $1 billion in aid has been given. This dwarfs the entire Russian military budget. What exactly is going on here? Well, you're fighting with an adversary that's happy to throw his meat wave at you, and they have had 6 months to mine the fields mine the lines while we have not gotten the equipment to them. So it's a thorny situation. Okay. Russian MOD says a lot more new ships coming. Any truth to that? Well, they could say that, but I'm not sure exactly how they're going to do that unless they're producing it in the Black Sea, because the Black Sea is essentially controlled by Turkey, who's not going to let anyone in. Okay. The Snake, again, this is the same guy that was asking this stuff up here about me. You've made it perfectly clear that you do not support Trump in the Republican primary election. It's looking very likely that Trump will be the Republican candidate. Would you now be perfectly clear, will you vote for Trump if he's a Republican candidate in November 2024? Unless Trump has some kind of miraculous conversion experience on Ukraine, no, I don't plan to vote for Trump. I'm not going to vote for the Democrat either. I can't do that, so I'll probably vote for somebody who doesn't have a snowball's chance because he's not even on the ballot. But no, I'm not going to support Trump as long as he holds this position about Ukraine. What's going on in Ukraine is incredibly important to the entire world, and that's why I'm even doing these right now. I've 700 some odd videos in. Give me some credit. I mean, like, what? Okay. Okay. Is there any Russian threat anymore? Huh? Of course. I don't understand why you would even ask that. Hi, Professor. If the Ukrainians take down the Kerch Bridge, take out the rail system, sink all the Russian troop carriers, how will the Russians be able to evacuate Crimea? Well, they can evacuate with planes. They can evacuate. They'll probably have a ferry system of some sort for a bit, but I don't think that they're thinking about evacuating. They're trying to hold it right now, and the Ukrainians are trying to make it untenable. How many boats of the Ukrainian fleet have been crossed out? Nothing is left. There was really no Ukrainian fleet. I did a video about the Russian naval superiority early on, and they essentially had nothing. They scuttled their own. The only big ship that they had, they scuttled early on. They made a decision. This is untenable. We can't defend this. Okay, Lou Hammer. This is I think he had a name on it once of like Armageddon or General Armageddon or something along those lines once upon a time. Are you aware that Russia manufactures 10 new Navy ships per year? So after 1.5 years in Ukraine, Russia has lost 5 ships but made 15 new ships, meaning even with combat losses, Russia has added 10 new ships to their fleet that they won't be able to get into the Black Sea because Turkey controls it, but okay. My real question is, where will Russia launch their offensive from this fall winter? Ukraine took out 2 landing ships. That means naval landing to Odessa is probably out. There's still 50,000 Wagners in Belarus. Do you really think that? 50,000? Like, there was only maybe 15,000 when it was all said and done left, but 50,000 in Belarus is, I don't know what you're reading. Then there's 500,000 new contract soldiers Russia's training up for an offensive ops in Kharkiv. Do you know that that's why the Kupians, Lou, I would absolutely love it if you could provide the links and sources. Go in YouTube. If you want to communicate with me, by the way, people, go to YouTube and go to channels and not channels. I'm sorry. Go to community and then go down into well, there's a community about. Sorry, go to about and then go down here and look for view email address and Professor Gerdes yt@gmail.com. So Lou, I'm asking you, email me the sources that you're reading because the sources that you are drawing from are not sources that I see. So maybe I'll learn something in the process, but those numbers seem wildly like the 50,000 Wagners in Belarus or another 500,000 new contract soldiers, wildly high to my mind, but I would love to read what it is that you think is reality. Okay, so if you could do that, I would love to see that. Okay, yes, when do you expect Ukraine to win the war and reject the Russians from all their territory? Not anytime soon. I don't think it'll happen in 2023. It could happen in 2024, depending on how things go. If I were a betting man, I wouldn't bet on it because there is a lot that has to happen. And so this is not a terribly optimistic. I think it's realistic, but it could possibly happen there. I don't think that there's any likelihood that this is going to end in 2023. When will they destroy the Crimea Bridge completely? And I don't think they have to destroy it completely. They just have to sever it. So, but when will they sever it? I think that that's coming sooner than later. Why does Ukraine have statues dedicated to the people who initiated the brutal Galatia genocide of the Poles and Jews and other ethnic groups in 1943? Stefan Bandera. Okay, this is a perennial question from trolls. The only reason that Ukrainians revere Bandera was because he supported Ukrainian nationhood, not because of any other reasons or attachments or working with Nazis or anything else like that, but because he supported a united Ukraine. That's it. End of story. And so you can then point to, well, these statues to Nazis or whatever. It's not because they're Nazis. It's not because they work with Nazis. It's not any of that. It's because they supported Ukraine as a nation. And remember, Ukraine, as has been before that, was dominated by the Soviets, who in the 30s had the Holodomor, where millions of Ukrainians perished under the thumb of the Soviets. So they're not new to this. They recognize what's happened. Okay, last question. My question would be, who the blank takes you seriously? Well, okay. I mean, you don't have to, but you don't have to watch either. And that's all right. You won't hurt my feelings. All right. That's it. That's all the questions that I have here. When I asked my question yesterday about the drone strikes and attacks in the Kerch and the Black Sea. And thank you for your time and attention. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow. I hope you will be too. And thank you, thank you, thank you. If you're at this point, you really care. And I just want to say you're awesome.